we can go ahead and transition into our next topic, Jordan, and we're going to talk a little transfer portal. And interestingly enough, the transfer portal has been somewhat quiet in the world of college football, not just for the Clemson Tigers, but college football as a whole. A lot of people were talking coming into this transfer portal window that opened up this past Monday, right? Been open up for 4 days now, talking about, it was going to be crazy. It was going to be, kind of a big time transfer portal window. There was going to be a lot of big names. There was going to be a lot of big transfers. Fan bases were going to be freaking out here and there. And it hasn't been the case so far. Now, things could still happen. There's still spring games to be played, right? So there's still a lot of teams that are going to play their spring game. And, people that are going to transfer in spring are going to tend to transfer after the spring game as opposed to before the spring game. But it hasn't been quite as is on fire as we anticipated, heading up to the last portal window, obviously, before we hit fall camp and start the 2024 campaign. Clemson has yet to have a player enter the transfer portal at all. So good news for the Tigers. There's no news. So in the transfer portal season, if you're a Clemson Tigers fan, no news is good news.
Right. Not like we're taking anybody. So
yeah, we ain't taking anybody. So if there's any news for Clemson in the transfer portal cycle, it's usually bad news because somebody's leaving and going to another university to play football. So what are your thoughts on, obviously, the transfer portal situation at Clemson? Do you think there still will be some individuals who decide to enter the transfer portal for Clemson? And then from a national standpoint, are you surprised by the lack of transfer portal entries since Monday?
Yeah. From a Clemson perspective, obviously this is a 15-day window from so there is still obviously a lot of time for things to change.
Oh yeah.
And it can, and it's important to reiterate that the transfer portal window is just the amount of time you have to put your name in.
Right.
You can put your name in and wait till the window ends. You can wait up to the very last day. But as long as you put your name in, you're eligible to transfer and be eligible for the next season. And now, of course, with the new rule that you can, as long as you're academically eligible, you can transfer as many times as you want. It definitely adds another wrinkle to it. So a guy could theoretically enter the transfer portal, transfer, commit somewhere, and then transfer again within that 15-day window. So there's a lot of crazy things. Yeah. So there's still a lot of time left. But from a Clemson standpoint, obviously, like you said, no news is good news. We've heard a couple of names that but before the window opened that were they kind of been swirling around in the rumor mills. But so far, obviously it's pretty quiet. Now I'll say, if I had to put money on it, I would still expect some departure, or maybe a few for Clemson at some point during this window. But so far, with and this kind of transitions to your next question about just college football in general, we haven't seen a ton of big names really enter the portal.
Right.
It hasn't been the on fire, just names you wouldn't expect. It was kind of advertised that, oh my God, like this is going to be the wildest transfer portal cycle we've seen in a minute. And, so far, again, I will say so far, it hasn't really been the case. There have been a couple of names that, but there hasn't been that bombshell, there was, Cormani McClain from Colorado, that obviously big name, former 5-star. He transferred. Jacoby Matthew from Texas A&M. You had that defensive lineman from Kent State that was light did it again. Why is it's my ring light? I don't know why it's stopped working. Okay, well, I'll fix that later. But but there just hasn't been a ton of big names. I see people in the chat mentioning Jaden Rashada. Yeah, of course he entered as well. Obviously, his recruitment was a roller coaster from an NIL standpoint, and ended up at Arizona State. But now he's in the portal. But yeah, there hasn't been that just like, oh my God, I never expected him to enter the portal, or
Right.
It hasn't really been that. For all of the guys that have entered, they're kind of like, well, I kind of understand why he did. Maybe Jacoby Matthew from A&M was a little surprising because he was a starter. But I don't know. They're just, again, there hasn't, the Louisville linebacker was a starter, but Louisville fans seem to think that he lost his starting spot. I don't know. But there hasn't been that bombshell household name enter, and you just kind of thought that was going to be the case. And so knock on wood. But it doesn't seem like it's going to be as crazy as maybe we thought. But and I've seen some theories that guys are just kind of waiting to see whether they'll their collectives will pony up their last paycheck before they enter, or they're still negotiating. Which, hey, in some cases that might be the case.
For sure. Yeah.
But so far it hasn't been as hectic, and I don't think Clemson is going to be. Let me not say that. I think Clemson is in a good spot to retain pretty much most of the guys they expect to rely on.
Right.
So I'm leaving the door open for a surprise name here or there, but it doesn't seem like it's going to be just a wild, catastrophic, departure that we didn't expect. If Clemson does have a departure, so that was my long-winded answer to your question on Clemson and kind of the portal window in general. It hasn't been what we thought it would be so far. So we'll see if things change in the coming week or so.
Yeah, I think it's pretty interesting. Obviously, we have until April 30th. The transfer portal window will be open for 15 days. So from April 15th to April 30th, all these players have the ability to enter their name in the transfer portal, and they can take their time deciding on where they go. As long as they enter it before that April 30th date expires, they will be free to transfer. You mentioned the rule that the NCAA has been about. I think they had their last meeting today about it. Sounds like it's going to be a go. I think there's some formality of approval that has to happen come Monday, but obviously it's just formality. The new transfer portal rule will be enacted because, well, let's face it, the NCAA can't enforce any of their transfer portal rules anyway. All they do is end up in court. All they do is get smacked by every court that they end up in. So, the rule on transfers is there are no rules. That's the new rule for transfer. So you can transfer as many times as you want to as many schools as you want. It doesn't matter. As long as you're academically eligible, you can transfer within the transfer windows, obviously, to any school you want. And obviously the only stipulation is you can't play for more than one team in a given season. So those are really the only limitations to the transfer portal rule at this point. Now, speaking from a Clemson standpoint, I think it's important for as much flack as Clemson gets in the transfer portal arena, if you will, right? Dabo Swinney gets killed for the transfer portal. Clemson as a university, as a football program, gets killed for how they go about the transfer portal. And obviously Dabo Swinney is the one that sets that culture and makes those big decisions, right? But what I will say is that you have to give credit where credit is due, right? And Clemson for a long time has been less affected than a lot of schools out there when it comes to the transfer portal. And the one reason is because as much as everybody in the national media and certain fans out there want to say that Clemson doesn't dabble in the NIL world and they don't do NIL and all this stuff, yes, they do. And they do it for roster retention. So I think it's important to give credit where credit is due. This is what Clemson has traditionally been really good at since the transfer portal, became a thing. They've been really good at roster retention. We talked about it on last week's show, Jordan, about how we couldn't think of, too many big names that have left Clemson, especially starters. There's been a few here and there, but a lot of times there's, a disciplinary situation or something else that's going on there. Traditionally, Clemson does not lose starters. And one thing that they have done really well at Clemson with their NIL is be able to retain their current roster. So as much as they don't use NIL to recruit high school players and portal players, they do use it to keep players on their roster that they already, have on the football team. So I think there's something to be said there. A lot of people disagree with, should Clemson change their philosophy on the transfer portal? Should they not? Should they change their philosophy on how they use NIL? I think there's legitimate arguments on both sides, but I think it's important to point out the fact that I think it's no coincidence that Clemson doesn't lose nearly the amount of players that other universities do. And I think the reason is how they divvy out their NIL and how they make it focused on, hey, you're here. You've proven that you're dedicated to this program. Here's some money for all your hard work, right?
Absolutely. And I think one of the other things that, I think it's kind of almost a self-fulfilling prophecy in a way, because just due to how Clemson, recruits. I think they do a good job of identifying guys that are true culture fits and that, are going to want to stay. Every team tries to do that, but, I think Clemson in particular has done a fairly good job. We've talked about Clemson hasn't really lost a ton of guys that we said, oh man, we kind of wish we had him this year.
Right.
So, you're going to, they're not immune to the transfer portal, and they've certainly lost a player here or there
Sure.
that you would have liked to have kept. But, overall, it hasn't, hurt them as much, because I think they've done a good job of evaluation from not just from a talent standpoint, but from a culture fit personality standpoint. It's like, are you a guy that's going to jump at the the nearest or at the soonest offer that you can get? Clemson doesn't recruit a ton of those guys. And they've done it. And, it's something kind of Dabo talked about. He said it, one thing that the NIL has made it easier for him is recruiting, from a just kind of identifying who wants to be here and who doesn't. It's just made it a lot easier. It's like, well, if you come in here asking me, your first thing you're asking about is money. Well, we're probably not, not who you need to go with, and probably not who we need to add. And there's nothing wrong with a player asking about compensation and prioritizing that. I don't think that's an issue, but clearly that means that these two, the player and school are not a fit, and so it makes it easier, and you don't waste your time inviting this kid, this particular recruit to on visits or in recruiting events, and they're not really particularly interested in you, because you can't offer what they're maybe being offered somewhere else. So I think with all of that put together, I think that's one of the things that the way Clemson goes about doing things has helped, and player from a player retention standpoint. So I do think Clemson needs to make some tweaks in how they operate within the portal space.
Yeah.
But you can't deny the positives from kind of and how it's helped from a recruiting standpoint and a player retention standpoint. So there's still a lot of time left in this transfer portal window, so I don't want to speak too soon and say, oh man, Clemson's going to keep everybody, because that's probably not going to be the case. And maybe they do lose somebody that we don't expect, but just with how they've gone about doing things, it's been few and far between, compared to their peers. And I think that's something that should be noted.
Yeah, absolutely. I just think it's important to highlight that kind of stuff when we can, because I get a little tired of the narrative that Clemson doesn't do NIL. Like it's really, I'm not going to get off on a tangent or anything like that, but it's really lazy. And I still hear a lot of people say it, like Clemson doesn't do the transfer portal. Okay, that's true. We don't use the transfer portal. But when people say, "Oh, Clemson don't use the transfer portal or NIL," they need to evolve as a program. Like Clemson uses NIL. Now, with that said, like Clemson doesn't have, the NIL that a lot of these bigger alumni bases have. Clemson's a smaller school. They don't have, quite the money. We don't got, Tyson chicken like Arkansas or Nike like Oregon has, right? Like we don't have those type of alums, at Clemson, and it's a smaller alumni.
We have Hooters.
We got Hooters.
Hooters NIL deal.
Yeah, we got Hooters, so you can get a Hooters NIL deal. But Clemson just traditionally, they're not going to be able to keep up with these schools that have these massive alumni bases when it comes to NIL stuff. It's just the fact of the matter. So they do have to be a bit more calculated when it comes to how they divvy up this NIL stuff, because it's not just unlimited. Like, you can't just throw all this NIL money out here and it's just going to magically keep refilling, right? Eventually, the NIL coffers, they're going to run dry. And then what do you do, right? So, as much as I would like Clemson to be a bit more aggressive in the transfer portal with cherry picking a few players here and there based off of your roster and based off of needs, I also do think it's important that they spend majority of their NIL on roster retention, because tampering and all this other stuff is running rampant in college football. And if you're not using NIL to keep players in the building that are already in the building, you're going to lose a lot of players. So I think that's important as well. But, it's just one of those things that I like to point out when I can. That Twin Peaks is better than Hooters, David Wood said. I'll take your word for it.
But, I've only ever been to Hooters, so I don't have a comparison. Are we talking food or something else?
I don't know what he's talking. I have no idea. We probably shouldn't get into that. We probably shouldn't get into that.
Yeah.
Tig says Twin Peaks equals Hooters.
I'll take your word for it.
At least the business model is pretty similar. So,
yeah, very, very similar.
If you're talking business model, that's probably a correct statement for sure.
Great chicken. That's their selling point for sure.
Great, yeah, selling chicken wings. Absolutely. Selling chicken wings.